Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we look at Brazil, where the trial of former President Bolsonaro is set to conclude, with any guilty verdict almost certain to spark nationwide unrest. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we cover the collapse of the Bayrou government in France and a general strike that has paralyzed key sectors. We assess Russia's drone incursion into Poland and its record-breaking aerial strikes on Ukraine, as well as Israel's escalation with Hamas after a strike in Doha. Finally, in the Asia-Pacific, we examine the political crisis in Nepal following the resignation of the Prime Minister and major civil unrest. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Brazil awaits the outcome of Jair Bolsonaro's trial. The Brazilian Supreme Federal Court is concluding proceedings against the former president, who faces multiple charges. Bolsonaro is accused of instigating a coup attempt after losing the 2022 election, membership in an armed criminal organization, plotting the assassinations of President Lula and Justice Alexandre de Moraes, damage to federal property, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 40 years in prison. The case is being decided by a 5-justice panel. As of September 11th, 3 justices have already voted, with the final 2 set to cast their votes by September 12th. Justice Flávio Dino has voted to convict Bolsonaro, as has Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who is presiding over the case and is also one of the alleged targets of the coup attempt and assassination plots. Justice Luiz Fute dissented, arguing that Bolsonaro should be acquitted and questioning whether the court has jurisdiction, given that Bolsonaro is no longer president. Now, our intelligence team's assessment, the divided votes within the Supreme Court, highlight Brazil's deep political polarization, with the wider population almost certainly more divided than the court itself. Bolsonaro continues to command strong support, particularly among evangelicals, business elites, conservative middle classes, and segments of the military and police. Recent demonstrations in his support have been staged in Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, and São Paulo to coincide with the trial. In one incident, 6 portable toilets were set on fire in suspected arson near the Supreme Court building in Brasilia. Bolsonaro's supporters have consistently alleged that the trial is politically motivated and that the 5-member panel is biased. Justice Moraes' role as both presiding judge and alleged assassination target, Justice Fuchs's dissent, and US President Trump's claim of a witch hunt will all likely be used to reinforce this narrative. The remaining justices are widely expected to vote against Bolsonaro, which would result in a guilty verdict and, highly likely, a long prison sentence. Such a verdict would almost certainly trigger major protests in support of the former president. Several previous demonstrations have already escalated into violence, including after the 2022 election and the January 8, 2023 riot. The Trump administration has imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil and sanctioned several key figures, including Justice Moraes. There is a realistic possibility that a guilty verdict could lead to further pressure from Washington, a move that Bolsonaro's base would almost certainly exploit to fuel additional unrest against the Brazilian government. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where France is grappling with the collapse of the Bayrou government and a wave of union-led strikes. On September 8th, the government of Prime Minister François Bayrou collapsed after losing a parliamentary confidence vote. Bayrou had called the vote in late August in an attempt to gain momentum for his austerity program, which aimed to reduce the government deficit. President Emmanuel Macron quickly appointed Sébastien Lecornu as the new prime minister. Lecornu is regarded as a loyalist within Macron's centrist liberal camp. On September 10th, several French unions in the transport, healthcare and education sectors launched a general strike. The strike, called Let's Shut Everything Down, began as an online movement opposing Bayrou's austerity policies, but later gained support from multiple unions and the far-left France Unbowed Party. The strike caused severe transport and service disruptions, with reports of road blockades, vandalism targeting public infrastructure, and clashes between police and protesters. More than 300 people were arrested between September 10th and 11th, and local media reported that dozens of protesters and police officers were injured. Unions have already announced further strike action planned for September 18th. Now our assessment. Civil unrest in France is highly likely to continue in the short term. Its severity will almost certainly depend on how President Macron and new Prime Minister Le Cornu choose to handle the crisis. While the France Unbowed Party has already pledged a no-confidence vote against Le Cornu, other parties are likely to wait until the new cabinet is announced and Le Cornu clarifies his stance on his predecessor's austerity policies. Still, Le Cornu is likely to face the same political deadlock as his predecessors, with Parliament divided into 3 blocs unwilling to cooperate. In the medium term, if the government fails to address the political crisis in a way that satisfies the opposition, violent episodes during protests are likely. These could include acts of vandalism targeting both public and private assets in major cities. As of September 11th, the protests have only partly achieved their stated goals, likely due to an effective police response coordinated by the government. The most notable disruptions have been to rail and air travel, with police proving more effective at clearing road blockades. While the political crisis is most likely to benefit large populist parties, it is also likely to be exploited by third actors seeking to destabilize the French state. As shown by the anarchist-linked sabotage of the rail network ahead of the 2024 Olympics, several domestic groups retain both the interest and the capability to cause nationwide disruption, particularly against infrastructure. France has also been targeted by multiple foreign-sponsored hybrid warfare operations designed to fuel civil strife. These include the defacing of a Holocaust memorial in Paris in 2024, an incident likely tied to Russian intelligence. On September 9th, French media reported a similar action. Several pigs' heads were discovered near mosques in Paris, almost certainly orchestrated to inflame interreligious tensions and further destabilize society. Staying in the region, where Poland reported an unprecedented Russian drone incursion into NATO airspace. Overnight from September 9th to 10th, Russian forces launched a large-scale wave of strikes against Ukraine, involving more than 400 drones and 40 missiles, primarily targeting western Ukraine. During the attack, at least 19 drones entered Polish airspace. Polish F-16 and Dutch F-35s under NATO command were scrambled, while Italian AWACS surveillance aircraft and German Patriot batteries were also activated. 3 to 4 of the drones were intercepted, while the rest crashed without causing casualties. The incursion also disrupted operations at airports in Warsaw, Modlin, and Rzeszów. Flights have since resumed, but Polish authorities have introduced air restrictions along the eastern border with Belarus and Ukraine until December 9th. The Polish military command described the incident as an act of aggression. Prime Minister Donald Tusk told Parliament that this was the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II, but stressed there was no reason to believe we're on the brink of war. On September 10th, Warsaw invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, which brings urgent matters to the North Atlantic Council. Moscow has denied responsibility for the incursion, arguing that the drone's maximum range of 700 kilometers made it impossible. Some of the drones reportedly entered from Belarus, with the Belarusian General Staff claiming they had gone off course due to Ukrainian electronic warfare. Now our team's assessment. It is highly unlikely that NATO's Article 5 will be invoked. Article 5 requires members to collectively respond to an armed attack on one of their allies. A NATO source told the press that the alliance is not currently treating the drone incursion as an attack. However, this is only the 8th time Article 4 has been invoked since NATO was founded in 1949. Most recently, it was triggered by several Eastern European nations, including Poland, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There have been at least 6 previous Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These were typically attributed to Ukrainian electronic warfare, which has been effective at jamming incoming drones and sometimes causes them to go off course. Such deviations, however, were usually localized. In one recent case on August 20th, an unidentified object fell and exploded near the village of Osini in Lublin Voivodeship. Photographic evidence showed debris from an engine used in Russia's Shahed drones, and Polish authorities later confirmed it was a Russian drone. Warsaw has likely sought to downplay the impact of these earlier incidents, but there are 2 key factors that make the September 9th to 10th incursion different. First, the scale. It was by far the largest incursion to date, roughly tripling the total number of projectiles that have fallen in Poland since 2022. Second, it was the first time Polish and NATO air defense systems have directly intercepted a Russian aerial threat during the war. It is highly unlikely that the September 9th to 10th incursion was simply the result of Ukrainian electronic warfare. Russian drones primarily rely on satellite-based navigation systems to follow pre-programmed flight paths. Because these drones can access multiple satellite constellations, the chances of all signals being simultaneously jammed along a long flight path are low. In addition, most drones are equipped with inertial navigation systems, which allow them to continue toward their targets even when satellite signals are disrupted. While inertial navigation gradually accumulates errors, this usually causes a miss of up to tens of kilometers, not a deviation of hundreds of kilometers, as seen in this case. The scale, coordination, and flight paths of the drones all suggest intentionality. At least 5 of the drones appeared to be heading toward Rzeszów-Jasionka Airport, a critical NATO logistics hub for military aid to Ukraine, according to a senior military source. Photographs of the wreckage indicate that some of the drones were Gerber decoys. These drones were not armed with explosive warheads and were not equipped with cameras for reconnaissance. If this was indeed an intentional Russian operation, which is highly likely, Russian planners likely chose to use non-weaponized drones to reduce the risk of severe escalation. There are likely several reasons why Russia would intentionally send drones into Poland. First, it allows Moscow to test NATO's resolve and its willingness to respond to Russian aggression. Second, it tests NATO's defensive capabilities and reaction times against Russian hardware. Third, it likely aims to deter support for Ukraine. If the targeting of Rzeszów-Jasionka Airport is confirmed, it would almost certainly represent a symbolic warning, given the hub's central role in NATO's military aid to Kyiv. In the immediate future, NATO's posture in Eastern Europe is almost certain to harden. The Zapad 2025 war games, held by Russia and Belarus, are scheduled for September 12th to 16th, with maneuvers expected near Poland and Lithuania. In response, NATO has already been conducting its own exercises. Poland began its largest drills of the year in early September with Iron Defender 25, and Tarasis 25 is running until the end of October, involving 10 northern European NATO countries. Tensions at NATO's border with Russia are almost certainly at their highest since 2022, which increases the risk of miscalculation and escalation. The drone incursion highly likely marks an escalation in Moscow's tactics, techniques, and procedures in its campaign against NATO member states, a campaign usually designed to stay below the threshold of direct conflict. If NATO reacts too forcefully, it risks escalation. If the response is too minimal, it risks failing to deter future incursions. Should such actions become a sustained Russian tactic, the risk of miscalculation and escalation will almost certainly increase while also undermining NATO's credibility. Still in the region, Ukraine has faced the largest aerial strikes of the war, including a direct hit on a government building in Kyiv. Overnight, from September 6th to 7th, Russian forces launched the biggest combined strike package so far, with around 810 one-way attack drones and decoys, along with 13 missiles. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted most of them, but 54 drones and 9 missiles still struck 33 locations. The strikes targeted Kyiv, Sumy, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia, with Kyiv as the main focus. At least 4 people were killed and 44 injured. In Kyiv's Sviatoshinsky district, a 9-story residential building was partially destroyed. Most notably, a projectile struck Ukraine's Cabinet of Ministers building in central Kyiv. Ukrainian officials said it was an Iskander-K cruise missile. The warhead failed to detonate, but the missile fuel caused a fire and damaged the building. Russian forces launched another major wave of drone and missile strikes overnight from September 9th to 10th. The attack reportedly involved 415 attack drones and decoys, along with 43 missiles. According to the Ukrainian Air Force, 16 missiles and 21 drones hit their targets. 1 person was killed in Zhytomyr Oblast, and 3 were injured in Khmelnytsky Oblast. Civilian industrial sites in Vinnytsia Oblast were also struck. This wave was largely focused on western Ukraine, and as covered earlier, at least 19 drones crossed into Polish airspace. Now our assessment. The scale of Russian long-range strikes against Ukraine continues to escalate. Since the start of 2025, Russia has dramatically increased the size of its aerial attacks. Between June and August, Russian forces repeatedly broke records for the size of combined strike packages before a temporary lull in the run-up to the August 15th Alaska summit between Presidents Trump and Putin. That pause was almost certainly meant to ease pressure from Washington, as large-scale Russian strikes had been a key trigger for backlash from the Trump administration. But since the summit, Russia has resumed record-breaking attacks. The September 6th to 7th strike further highlights that the risk profile for travel to Ukrainian cities far from the front lines is now at its highest since the early stages of the full-scale invasion. Several trends, and a potential change in Russian tactics, can be drawn from the recent strikes. First, the Ukrainian Air Force did not claim to intercept any of the 4 ballistic missiles launched overnight on September 6th and 7th, and only 4 of the 9 cruise missiles were shot down. Ukraine has long been particularly vulnerable to ballistic missiles. Its main countermeasure is the US-supplied Patriot system, with the less numerous and less effective SAMP/T playing a smaller role. This week, Western and Ukrainian officials warned that Ukraine risks shortages of air defense weapons. Deliveries have slowed, with shipments becoming more irregular and smaller since the Pentagon's June memo raising concerns about the scarcity of Patriot interceptors for US needs. A critical shortfall in interceptor munitions would almost certainly allow Russian forces to strike high-value targets more frequently and more deeply inside Ukraine, raising the risks for urban centers far from the front lines. Second, the strike on Ukraine's Cabinet of Ministers building, if intentional, likely marks a significant shift in Russian targeting. This is the first time a government building has been hit in Kyiv. While the damage was relatively limited, the attack was almost certainly symbolic. Had the warhead detonated, the damage would have been severe. Central Kyiv is heavily defended, and Russian forces have typically failed to strike this area. The so-called government and hotel districts have therefore been relative safe havens, hosting international visitors and organizations. Still, debris from intercepted missiles and drones has posed risks in these areas. Recent examples include damage to the British Council and EU delegation buildings. A successful strike in central Kyiv may also influence Russia's future targeting. Because Kyiv has a heavy concentration of air defenses, there is a realistic possibility that Russia had previously avoided prioritizing strikes in the city center. But if Moscow now assesses that Ukraine's interceptor stocks are critically depleted, it is likely to increase strikes on central Kyiv. Without a major replenishment of air defense munitions, these attacks are likely to intensify during the winter, when ground operations slow and strikes on civilians carry the greatest psychological impact. Now moving on to the Middle East, where Israel has escalated its confrontation with Hamas, striking in Doha, Qatar. At around 3:45 p.m. local time, the Israel Defense Forces and the Israel Security Agency carried out a series of airstrikes in Doha's Latifa district under Operation Summit of Fire. Israeli officials said the attack targeted senior members of Hamas. Hamas channels reported that the strike killed 5 members of its negotiation team, a team currently engaged in talks with the United States on ending hostilities in Gaza and releasing the remaining hostages. Early Israeli accounts claimed that the dead included Khalil al-Hayya, the chairman of Hamas's political bureau, and Khaled Mashal, a former chairman. However, Hamas has said both men survived the strike, along with other senior leaders who were present at the meeting, including Zahir Jabarin, head of Hamas in the West Bank, and Mohammed Darwish, leader of Hamas's Shura Council. Qatari Foreign Ministry spokesperson Majed Al-Ansari released a statement saying that Qatar strongly condemns the strike, calling it cowardly. He said the criminal assault constitutes a blatant violation of international law and norms and poses a serious threat to the security and safety of Qataris and residents in Qatar. He added that Qatar will not tolerate this reckless Israeli behavior, the disruption of regional security, or any act that targets its security and sovereignty. Now for our intelligence team's assessment. The strike marks a significant escalation, with likely repercussions across the Arabian Peninsula. In the immediate term, it will almost certainly halt ongoing Israel-Hamas ceasefire negotiations, draw condemnation from Gulf states, and fuel heightened civil unrest in major cities worldwide. Qatar is a major non-NATO ally of the United States and hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. The strike, which Qatari officials almost certainly perceive as being backed or authorized by Washington, could jeopardize this relationship in the long term. Gulf Cooperation Council states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are likely to publicly support Qatar, despite their fragile ties with Doha, which stem from its alleged support for terrorism and Iran. For Hamas, the strike is likely to have major political ramifications. The survival of key leaders allows the group to preserve its leadership balance between Gaza and its external offices. However, the likely collapse of ceasefire negotiations could shift greater influence to Hamas's Gaza-based leadership, which is under mounting pressure from intensified Israeli operations aimed at securing control of Gaza City and is less likely to engage in serious dialogue. The strike on Hamas's senior leadership has also almost certainly jeopardized ongoing negotiations for the release of hostages, a development the Netanyahu administration will likely exploit to justify sustaining and potentially intensifying its operations in the Gaza Strip. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, Nepal has been rocked by major unrest, forcing the resignation of the Prime Minister. On September 8th, protests led by Gen Z erupted, targeting government corruption and the decision to restrict 26 unregistered social media and online platforms. These included X, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, and Snapchat. The ban came after the companies failed to register with the government within a 7-day deadline. In the days leading up to the protests, hashtags like NepoKid and NepoBabies trended online, helping build support for the movement. Several celebrities, journalists, opposition members, and other prominent figures, including the mayor of Kathmandu, endorsed the protests. Protests quickly escalated into clashes after demonstrators broke into a restricted area and entered the federal parliament premises. Security forces responded with live ammunition and tear gas, and the government imposed a curfew in several districts. The situation worsened on September 9th as crowds set fire to the parliament in Kathmandu, as well as the Hilton Hotel in Naxal. Protesters also attacked government buildings and the homes of political leaders. Unrest spread to several other cities across Nepal. Thousands of inmates have escaped from several prisons, with Nepali police estimating the number at more than 13,500. Many leaders have taken refuge with security forces, and Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli has resigned. With no replacement yet in place, the country is facing a power vacuum. Government efforts to placate protesters, including rescinding the social media ban, have failed to quell the unrest. So far, at least 34 people have been killed and more than 1,300 injured. On September 10th, the military imposed a nationwide prohibitory order until 5 p.m. local time, followed by a curfew lasting until 6 a.m. on September 11th. The curfew has since been extended, with all major roads across the country blocked. Only emergency service vehicles and flight passengers are allowed to move. Tribhuvan International Airport, Kathmandu's main international hub, was briefly closed but reopened later on September 10th. With the military taking control of Nepal's internal security, the streets of Kathmandu remained calm on September 10th and 11th. Although the military is now effectively in charge, the president, Ramchandra Pudel, and the army chief, Ashok Raj Sigdal, are preparing to hold talks with Gen Z representatives. Now, our intelligence assessment. The protests are unfolding against a backdrop of wider frustration over limited access to basic health care, ongoing food insecurity, and shortages of essential medicines. Nepal's economic challenges have been compounded by frequent flash flooding in recent months. In July and August, heavy floods disrupted trade and damaged hydropower plants. Meanwhile, members of the government are widely perceived as living in luxury. Nepal currently ranks 107th out of 180 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, with frequent corruption scandals and legal retaliation against journalists further fueling public anger. The government's decision to ban 26 major social media and online platforms was almost certainly seen as government overreach and as an attempt to quietly introduce censorship. Around half of Nepal's population uses these platforms, with Gen Z making up a disproportionate share of that user base. Communication apps like WhatsApp are especially important, as they're heavily relied on not only within Nepal, but also by diaspora communities abroad. It remains unclear what Gen Z protesters will ultimately demand in negotiations. Possible demands include the dissolution of parliament, new elections, and changes to how prime ministers are chosen, including direct elections and shorter term limits. Although the constitution requires the next and likely interim prime minister to be selected from current members of parliament, protesters may reject such an appointment. Instead, former chief justices or populist youth figures could emerge as potential candidates. The most likely figure is Kathmandu's mayor, Balendra Balen Shah. He endorsed the protests while urging restraint, and he is seen as relatively popular among Gen Z. While the protests have quieted for now, largely because of the military's deployment and the strict curfews, the situation remains highly volatile. If the government and military leadership fail to make meaningful concessions to Gen Z protesters, unrest could flare up again, bringing the risk of further violence and instability across Nepal's urban centers. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.